It was a cold, moonless night when Sarah pulled her car into the gas station. She had been driving for hours on the deserted highway, the vast expanse of nothingness stretching out in every direction. Her GPS had lost signal miles back, and the only company she had was the steady hum of her engine and the rhythmic thump of her tires on the cracked asphalt. When the gas station appeared out of the darkness, its neon sign flickering weakly, she breathed a sigh of relief. The station was isolated, standing alone in the middle of nowhere, its single pump bathed in the dim glow of a few flickering overhead lights. The building itself was old and decrepit, with paint peeling from its walls and a cracked window that seemed to stare out at her like a lifeless eye. A battered sign read, "Last Stop Gas and Convenience," swinging in the wind, its hinges creaking ominously. Sarah parked her car beside the pump and stepped out into the cold night air. The station felt eerie, almost surreal, as if it didn't belong in the world she had just driven through. She wrapped her jacket tighter around herself and walked toward the entrance, her footsteps echoing on the concrete. The door to the convenience store was heavy, resisting her push as if it hadn't been opened in years. A small bell jingled as she stepped inside, the sound swallowed by the thick silence that hung in the air. The store was dimly lit, with only a few fluorescent lights casting a sickly yellow glow over the dusty shelves. The aisles were lined with old, outdated products, cans of soup with labels from decades past, candy bars that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. Sarah approached the counter, where an old-fashioned cash register sat, covered in a thin layer of dust. Behind it was a large man, slumped in a wooden chair, his head tilted back as if he were asleep. He wore a faded flannel shirt and a trucker's cap pulled low over his eyes. The name tag on his chest read, "Hank." "Excuse me," Sarah said, her voice breaking the silence. The man didn't move. She stepped closer, her heart beginning to pound in her chest. "Sir?" Hank's head snapped forward suddenly, and Sarah gasped, stumbling back a step. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, staring at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. A slow, unsettling grin spread across his face, revealing yellowed teeth. "Welcome to Last Stop," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "What can I do for you?" Sarah hesitated, feeling a deep sense of unease. "I just need to pay for gas," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Hank nodded slowly, never breaking eye contact. "Cash only," he said. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a crumpled $20 bill, handing it to him with a trembling hand. Hank took the money, his fingers brushing against hers for just a moment, but the touch was enough to send a shiver down her spine. "Pump's all yours," Hank said, his grin widening. "But be careful out there, miss. Strange things happen on nights like this." Sarah forced a smile and nodded, backing away from the counter. She hurried out of the store, the bell's jingle echoing behind her, and made her way to the pump. The old machine groaned as she lifted the nozzle, the gas flowing sluggishly into her car. She couldn't shake the feeling that Hank was watching her, his eyes boring into her back. As she waited for the tank to fill, Sarah glanced around the station. Beyond the dim pool of light, the night was pitch black, the highway swallowed by the darkness. There was no sound except the faint whistling of the wind and the distant hum of her car engine. The isolation was overwhelming, as if she were the last person left in the world. Finally, the pump clicked off, and Sarah hurriedly replaced the nozzle. She was about to get back into her car when she noticed something odd, a faint glow in the distance, just beyond the edge of the station's light. It flickered like a candle flame, small and almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there. Curiosity gnawed at her, pulling her toward the light. She knew she should just leave, drive away and not look back. But something compelled her to investigate. She took a few tentative steps toward the glow, straining to see through the darkness. The light grew brighter as she approached, until she realized it was coming from a small clearing just off the highway, hidden by a line of trees. As she reached the edge of the clearing, she stopped, her breath catching in her throat. In the center of the clearing stood an old, rusted car, its headlights flickering weakly. The car was covered in dirt and grime, its windows shattered and its tires flat. But it wasn't the car that made Sarah's blood run cold. It was the figure slumped over the steering wheel. The figure was a man, his face hidden in the shadows. His clothes were tattered and dirty, and his skin was pale, almost translucent in the weak light. Sarah felt a wave of nausea as she realized that the man wasn't moving. She took a step closer, her heart hammering in her chest. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Are you okay?" There was no response. The man remained motionless, his head resting against the steering wheel. Sarah's mind raced, her instincts screaming at her to run, but something kept her rooted to the spot. Slowly, she reached out and touched the car's door handle. It was cold, slick with moisture. She pulled it open with a creak, the sound loud in the stillness of the night. The man's body shifted slightly with the movement, but he still didn't respond. Sarah leaned in, her hand shaking as she reached for his shoulder. She hesitated for a moment, then shook him gently. "Sir?" As her hand made contact with his shoulder, the man's head snapped up and Sarah stumbled back with a scream. His eyes were wide and unseeing, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream. His skin was cold and clammy, his face twisted in an expression of terror. Sarah backed away, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She turned and ran back toward her car, her feet slipping on the loose gravel. She could feel the man's lifeless eyes on her, could hear the soft whisper of the wind as it seemed to carry his silent scream. She reached her car and fumbled with the door handle, her hands trembling so badly she could barely get it open. Finally, she managed to slip inside, slamming the door behind her. She jammed the key into the ignition and turned it, the engine roaring to life. Without a second glance, she slammed her foot on the gas and sped out of the station, the tires screeching on the asphalt. The station's neon sign flickered in her rearview mirror, growing smaller and smaller as she raced down the highway. But as she drove, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man's twisted face staring back at her. But there was nothing there. Just the empty road and the darkness that pressed in on all sides. She drove for what felt like hours, the road stretching endlessly before her. The fear began to fade, replaced by exhaustion. Her eyes grew heavy, the adrenaline wearing off, leaving her drained. She needed to find a place to rest, somewhere safe, away from the horrors of the night. As she rounded a bend in the road, Sarah saw lights in the distance, another gas station. Relief washed over her. She could stop, get her bearings, maybe find someone who could help her. She pulled into the station, the familiar neon sign casting its glow over her car. She got out, her legs unsteady, and walked toward the entrance. The station looked exactly like the one she had just left, right down to the peeling paint and the cracked windows. Even the sign was the same. Last stop, gas and convenience. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She turned and looked back at the highway, then back at the station. How could this be? She had driven for miles, and yet here she was, back where she started. She hesitated at the door, her hand hovering over the handle. The bell jingled softly as she pushed it open, stepping inside. The store was exactly the same as before, The same dusty shelves, the same sickly yellow light, and behind the counter, slumped in the same wooden chair, was Hank. He looked up as she entered, his bloodshot eyes locking onto hers. A slow grin spread across his face, the same unsettling grin that had chilled her to the bone. "Back so soon?" he rasped, his voice dripping with malice. "Thought you'd be gone for good." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. I just need directions," she stammered, her voice trembling. "How do I get out of here?" Hank chuckled, a low, menacing sound that sent shivers down her spine. "Oh, you can leave any time you like," he said, leaning forward. "But you'll always end up right back here. No one ever leaves last stop." Sarah felt a cold dread settle over her. She backed away from the counter, her eyes darting around the store, searching for an escape. But there was none. Just the oppressive darkness outside and Hank's piercing gaze. "You might as well get comfortable," Hank continued, his grin widening. "This place has a way of keeping folks around. And besides, there's nowhere else to go. Just you, me, and the road. Forever." Sarah turned and ran for the door, the bell jingling as she burst outside. She jumped into her car and sped away, the tires screeching on the asphalt. But as she drove, the road stretched on endlessly, the darkness closing in around her. No matter how far she went, she couldn't escape the station. It was always there, waiting for her, a beacon in the night. Time lost all meaning as she drove in circles, the same scenes repeating over and over. The gas station, the dark highway, the eerie glow of the neon sign. They were all inescapable, part of a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Finally, exhausted and terrified, Sarah pulled over to the side of the road and slumped over the steering wheel. She couldn't fight it anymore. The road had trapped her, and there was no escape. As she closed her eyes, the last thing she saw was the flickering neon sign in the distance, growing closer and closer, until it was all she could see. And the last thing she heard was Hank's voice, echoing in her mind, a chilling whisper that promised she would never be free. "Welcome to Last Stop," he said, his voice a dark, haunting melody. "Your final destination."